Hello, Changemakers. Tom McGrath here. Before we get into today's superb episode, I'd like to take a moment to invite you all to Experience Everywhere, the first, biggest, and best virtual conference dedicated to improving digital employee experience in the work from anywhere world. This year's event features Adam Grant, Forrester, Gartner, and a ridiculous number of the world's leading digital workplaces, from Blackstone to Siemens to Toyota to Johnson & Johnson. The list goes on and on and on. It's free to attend, and last but not least, Tim and myself have the honor of hosting this year's event. There's one for the Americas on November the 16th and EMEA November 17th. So wherever you are, check the show notes for more info, or tap in nextvink.com/experience-2021/. And we look forward to seeing you there. Okay, on with the show.
You're listening to Digital Employee Experience, a show for IT changemakers. Let's get into the show.
Hello, changemakers. Welcome to the DEX show. I'm Tom McGrath, joined as ever by Tim Flower. Tim, how's it going?
As ever. Tom, it's going well. It's Friday, end of a long week, and it's always good to finish up a week with an exciting podcast recording.
Well, now we're going to have to release the pod on a Friday, you realize, Tim, right, to actually, keep. So don't mention the day next time I ask you, but we'll leave it as is anyway. But I'm very good, though. I'm very excited about this week's guest. And apropos, I have a question for you, Tim. You've obviously made your living as a technologist, but has there ever been a time where you felt technology could go from being your means of making a living to something that might make you, as a technologist, an unnecessary part of the overall process? Has that ever been, on your mind over the past few decades of work?
Yeah, I think it creeps in frequently. It's especially in the work that we do in automating things. Not only will I work myself out of a job, but I also think about the folks who our technology may impact and work them out of a job. So it's bigger than just me. But yeah, over the course of 30 plus years, that's always something. You try to stay relevant. You try to stay ahead of things. But yeah, it's kind of that slippery slope of how do I stay employed and active and valuable while not making myself irrelevant.
Of course. Well, I'm here, Tim, to reassure you today that you and I are fundamentally safe as houses. And I'll tell you why that is, because I feel very confident, very certain almost, that there will be no podcasting AI deep blue that could replicate our all too human DEX show magic together. So as long as we hold firmly right here, I think we can be relatively sanguine about the rise of the machines. But just in case, just to make sure of it, we do have a perfect guest in the guise of Ravin Jesuthasan, who can put our minds at ease, or perhaps otherwise. Ravin is a truly distinguished futurist author and speaker on the future of work, automation and human capital. He's a regular at Davos and WEF steering committees, as well as a host of other distinguished destinations, not least, as of today, the DEX show. Ravin, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tim. Great to be here.
I'd like to start, please, by asking you about what you think of personally, and if you like philosophically, as being work, your kind of key area of study for so long, and how has your own personal intellectual and professional history informed that understanding?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, Thomas. The way I think about it is, I think of work as being a contribution to some greater purpose, the contribution to an organization, to a cause, to a charity, whatever it might be. And I do think sometimes we narrow down the definition of work, and it excludes lots of really important things. I'll just pick on one example in the US, and I suppose it's probably a global phenomenon. I don't think we value care work nearly anywhere as much as we should. There's massive segments of the population who are engaged in care work, but it doesn't count as quote unquote employment. It doesn't count as work. It doesn't count as contributing to GDP. And I think that's a real mistake on our part. And so I do hope, as we think of, the future of work, a broader definition of work, I think, is probably what's needed.
Yeah, it's a good segue, I think, to kind of the concept of work. And its relation to technology, right? And technology is not just transistors and copper wires, right? It dates back further than our common knowledge of technology. Has it always been that way? What extent has work been defined through that relationship between people and technology, whatever it may be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tim, because if you think of technology as starting with maybe a flint that was used to create the first version of an axe or a knife, right? Those are sort of tools, right? Not technology in the sense of what we think about it, but those are tools. And so I think there's always been tools involved with work. And I also think, we've throughout history sort of, vacillated, if you will, between that dystopian view of whether it's tools and technologies, whether, when does that tool go from helping you be more productive to actually substituting you? I think the first ever essay about the rise of the machines was written by, I think it was a member of the Danish royalty when the loom was invented. And I think she was, decrying the impact of the loom and sort of predicting this mass levels of unemployment. And that was something back in the 1700s, perhaps. But I think, the reality is always something in between, right? It's never nearly quite as bad, and it's probably never nearly quite as optimistic. But I do think, what is interesting, Tim, to your question about the relationship between people and technology is, I think what's different where we are today is the speed and scale with which technology is sort of changing and new technologies are emerging. And I think that's the big change we're going through, because we've always coped, right, for however thousands of years of the world of work, broadly defined, or maybe more narrowly over the last, 400 or 500 years. But I think that what's different this time around, perhaps, has that continued increase in speed and scale. Is that a risk? Is it going to surpass our ability to cope, I guess? And to the opening discussion you and Thomas were having, is that what does that mean for our continued relevance? I think is probably the big question that's out there.
Yeah, and that's a big, fat, scary question too, right? And if we look at that automation, it's kind of defined commercial production since, as you mentioned, since the 18th century, right? So we're kind of on the verge of this concept of, and it's been talked about for a couple of years, but this fourth industrial revolution. And it's more than just moving from a legacy technology to something new. It's more of a blending and a merging of multiple things. So what distinguishes this fourth industrial revolution for you?
Yeah, it's I think the big thing that's different this time around, we talked about the speed and scale, but what's driving it is the convergence, as you've alluded to, right? So the blending of multiple technologies. If you look at probably a big trigger for this was the rise of just cloud-based computing, and how that fundamentally sort of democratized things like storage and application deployment. If you think of what happened with Web 2.0, the pivot to the mobile internet, and then what's starting to emerge with Web 3.0, with the metaverse. I think if you think of what 5G is doing in terms of not so much its consumer application, certainly very interesting, and we'll all benefit from being able to stream football matches much quicker and more effectively on our phones. But I think of the industrial applications of 5G as being really sort of game-changing, particularly in manufacturing and distribution and logistics. The proliferation of sensors, low-cost sensors, all of those things just coming together and both accelerating and acting as an accelerant for AI, I think is really what is unique, because, we've had AI, as you guys know, since the late 50s, what it never had was the infrastructure and all of these enabling capabilities that allow it to deliver the sort of value that we're starting to see.
And apropos of the fourth industrial revolution, Ravin, tell us about this concept, the democratization of work that I've come across in your own work, and how that connects to how companies are going to be ran in the future.
Yeah. Thomas, a really good question. Satya Nadella said in June of last year that, we've seen a 2-year trend in digitalization get accelerated in 2 months as a result of the pandemic. And a lot of people equate the future of work with, rampant digitalization. But to your question, I think the other force that drives the future of work is this notion of democratization of work. So a growing ability to rapidly decouple work from many of its traditional confines of space, time, and structure. And that, I think, is what is really interesting, because it's bringing a lot more people into the game, and it's also commoditizing certain things that were sort of at a premium. And so what democratization does is that it any sort of points of competitive advantage get whittled down very quickly, because you've got a much more efficient market, if you will.
So let's hone in on some of those decouplings, specifically the workplace. Where does the trend of the last couple of years and growing democratization leave that concept? Rather antiquated, I would say.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is increasingly going to be an antiquated concept, because I think its traditional confines of being physical in nature, right? I think it's going to get broadened quite significantly, because I think, the definition of workplace is going to include both real and online spaces. I think its role is going to change quite quickly. I think we've seen with many organizations, as they contemplate, a more sort of hybrid construct for work. The role of that physical space is no longer just for heads down, sort of independent, repetitive work, right? It's best used for when a physical connection is most beneficial to the work of the organization. And that often is, work related to innovation, work related to co-creation, etc. But again, I'll go back to what I said a second ago about Web 3.0, because I do think that as we see much greater sort of acceleration with, things like 5G, etc., we're going to see a blending of the physical and the virtual. And I think it'll get really quite interesting, because to your question, this definition of workplace is going to look very, very different. It's going to be very different, I think, 5 years from now.
So, I mean, these sort of circumstantial boundaries of space and time that used to define our working day and our working lives more broadly, as they start to kind of be decoupled, as you put it, where does that leave employees, and where does it leave the societies that these employees are citizens of? I mean, how can the societies anticipate these changes and bolster that lack of stability that some of these decouplings create?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I had the privilege of working with PBS on a documentary series called The Future of Work. It was a 3-part documentary series. And I thought they did an outstanding job of looking at how talent would be sort of brought, the implications for these changes, because I think as we move through boundaries of space, time, structure, etc., what it does is that it forces the individual to sort of adapt really quickly. And it goes back to the point I made earlier, right, about just the speed and scale of some of these changes. And I think in order to enable individuals and society to sort of adapt, I think what you really need is a much more collaborative set of interventions, where it's not just being left to companies, but it's a combination of companies, it's education, and it's government. I think that are essential to both getting getting people ready to be able to sort of continuously learn and upskill and reskill and having that mindset. So, which is a pretty significant sort of cultural change in virtually every society, but also creating, the safety nets that allow for the time to transition from one industry to another, that provide for soft landings, etc., that provide for the care of children while you're upskilling and reskilling, right? So that you've got in place the mechanisms that can bridge you as you sort of continue to stay relevant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we're kind of drilling down from a high level, right? We talked about the workspaces and workplaces that we work in and the impact there, and the large group of people and how it impacts our employees. So let's talk a little bit about kind of some specific groups of employees. What do you feel is kind of the impact of all of these changes specific to HR? Right, HR, I've talked a lot, and I've talked with a lot of people about the collaboration of HR with technology teams. What do you see the old function of HR? What do you see happening to that, and how is it being disrupted in this new kind of an age?
Yeah, I think HR is going to change dramatically. And certainly we've seen in many organizations, progressive companies like Unilever, just to pick on one. HR is a fundamentally different animal than it was, 5-10 years ago. And I think at the heart of it, Tim, is this pivot from its traditional role of being a steward of employment to increasingly being a steward of work. Because the work options that we have in an organization are, there's at least 8 to 10 new work options available to companies relative to where, we were in the second industrial revolution, where the choice was kind of a binary one. I either hire an employee, a new person, or I develop someone existing to do the work. And now you've got gig workers, you've got alliances, you've got outsourcing, you've got volunteers, for consumer goods companies, you've got AI, robotics, etc. So I think being a steward of all of these options is increasingly needed. I think the other key role is helping business leaders orchestrate this new work ecosystem. When does it make sense to use employees? How do I connect more people to my work than I might have in the past? How do I think beyond that traditional relationship of an employee in a job to increasingly thinking about, the many-to-many of skills to work? So I do think HR is going to change really dramatically, and I think an opportunity for the function to be even more pivotal to the organization's mission and purpose.
And what about the prevalent industry focus on employee experience, specifically within HR, Ravin? I mean, when you consider that wider trend, does it remain relevant in your view, this focus on culture, this focus on employee experience, when suddenly work has become so agile through the democratization process?
I do think we need to pivot from thinking about the employee experience to thinking about the talent experience. I had the CHRO of a very large technology company say to me once, our employees come join us because of the free food. But every day we use 3,500 people on these talent marketplaces that are out there. How do I ensure that these individuals who have a choice every single day choose us? How do I transcend that traditionally transactional relationship with a gig worker to be one that's much more sustainable? And so I do think we have to think more broadly about the talent experience. And I do think organizations need to think about how do I meet more and more people on their terms, as opposed to forcing a much smaller number to meet me on my terms. I think that's really going to be at the heart of kind of the new work experience.
So we're both IT guys. So let's talk a little bit about technology specific to IT. the IT team has traditionally always managed automation in the workplace, right? It's been the automation specialist. But now automation, it really has been a skill within a larger discipline, but it's really now becoming a bigger part of IT as a profession. And you could even make the case that automation is starting to become mainstream. Consumers and employees have access to things to automate their day-to-day that they never had before. What do you see it means for the function of automation as part of the IT profession?
Yeah, I think it's going to continue to be really important. And I can see, going back to the earlier question about the changing role of human resources, I do think that there is a really valid argument, and my good friend Bob Johansson from the Institute for the Future has written about this. There is a good argument, I think, for the convergence of IT and HR into a broader work management function. Because I think it's about the resources of the enterprise. And I think that traditional boundary of separating technology from talent is increasingly an artificial one. But I think what's really important, Tim, is, in many organizations, often it's left to sort of IT to sort of lead with the tech or lead with the automation. And I think that often leads to some dysfunction. Versus, I think if we had a more collaborative approach, the organizations who I see consistently be successful, and I've written about this in my last book, Reinventing Jobs, are the ones who lead with the work, as opposed to leading with the technology or leading with the automation. Because I think what it lets you do is shine a really bright spotlight on the many different roles that technology and automation can play, as opposed to, I think, very often when you lead with the tech, as I've seen it ends up in a very binary conversation of, is it the machine or the human? Versus, I think the impact actually can be far more nuanced and far more impactful, because you'll see opportunities for substitution, you'll see opportunities for augmentation, and then you'll, more importantly, see opportunities for complete transformation of the work, and then potentially demand for new human skills.
So early in my career, it was pointed out to me that our mainframe technicians and specialists needed to start to adapt to distributed computing. And I watched many of them refuse to adapt and refuse to change. They loved the mainframe. And what started to happen was it became too late in their career to adapt. And now they're just crossing their fingers, hoping that the technology stays relevant and they stay relevant until they retire. So there's always that need to adjust and adapt and stay current. How should the current technologists think about and anticipate and accommodate the new shifts when it's still kind of unwritten? We don't quite know where things are going to go.
I do think it's going to be about continuously trying to look around corners, trying to sort of see how the landscape of work is changing, and with that, what that might mean in terms of opportunities for either existing technology or potentially the evolution of existing technologies. I also think just the mindset, Tim, of looking at the connections to operations and HR, because if you can see how the work is changing, if you can see how the skills of the workforce are changing, then I think you get a much fuller picture of the role of IT and the implications for the different parts of IT.
Tell us, Ravin, about the concept of grey collar work and how this might relate to traditional technologist roles, such as those found in IT departments.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Thomas. We traditionally, as you both well know, have had this sort of binary view of white collar versus blue collar, and I think what you're now seeing as a result of just the rapid changes is those distinctions don't really make sense, right? And I think what you're seeing is as we blend, if you will, into gray collar work. I think what you're finding is there is a real need for both the technical skills associated with IT, as well as I think a lot of the soft skills, which we sort of alluded to earlier on, right? The things that sort of are essentially what make us human. So things like innovation, critical thinking, collaboration, etc. Because those are the things that fundamentally power our ability to stay relevant. Those technical skills, their half-life is shrinking dramatically, as we all know, for many, many technical skills in IT and in every other part of the organization. But what is going to sort of endure and what is going to probably rise in prominence because it's essential to our continued relevance are those truly human things, right? Of, can we innovate? Can we engage in critical thinking? Can we work collaboratively? Can we demonstrate the emotional intelligence required to sort of work collaboratively, etc.
I think for a long time we tend to think of our teams as doing positive work when we're all heading in the same direction. But you could say that heading in the same direction, if you're on parallel paths and not collaborating, is not the right paradigm. You want to head in opposite directions. What I mean by that is not moving away from each other, but moving towards each other in opposite directions, right? Getting closer to each other and collaborating. What do you think what's the future dynamic between IT and HR? What does it look like? I know we've covered it a little bit, but what does that dynamic between these two groups look like in the future?
Yeah, I think the only answer is, exponentially increased collaboration, right? Mm-hmm. As you've alluded to. I mentioned, the work that Bob Johansson has written about in terms of, even an integrated function. And I think it's two parts of the organization that traditionally have not worked very closely. Right. And some might even say that their traditional frames of reference are, the logic that underpins both, are almost like chalk and cheese. But I think it's that diversity, that difference is what can lead to a much more powerful combination. So I'm really keen to see, organizations, the ones who are going to be progressive and actually achieve the combination of HR and IT.
Fascinating stuff, Ravin. And just taking a step back, last of all, to look at the bigger picture. How do you expect some of the trends we've discussed today to really manifest themselves concretely over the next 5 years in what we presumably, hopefully, will know in the future as the post-pandemic era?
Yeah, I think there's probably going to be two really big things that companies have to deal with. One is, how do I connect as many people as possible and as seamlessly as possible to the work of to work? Beyond that traditional one-to-one relationship between a person and a position to kind of the many-to-many of skills to work, and then being able to seamlessly move between different work options, whether it's gig workers or employees, the use of robotics and AI, being able to work through those options as seamlessly as possible and pivot from one to another. I think that's the first part. I think the second, which I've sort of alluded to, is from a workforce perspective, how do I get as many people as possible into the game? How do I meet, everyone who contributes to my mission and purpose, employee or otherwise, increasingly on their terms, as opposed to forcing them to fit with mine? And I think those two things are just going to be absolutely pivotal for companies over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, that's a very resonant note to end on, I think, Ravin. So we'd definitely encourage anybody listening to seek out your further work and some of the links provided in the show notes, as well as NextThink's DEX Hub, where this podcast lives, and you can find a lot of insight into how to meet some of the challenges and opportunities presented by further IT automation in this realm specifically. Ravin, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. It's been my pleasure.
Fascinating conversation, Ravin. Thank you.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how NextThink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nextthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.